Hi, my name is Leslie Rach. I'd like to talk today about vegetarianism. More specifically, I'll talk about why I decided to become a vegetarian. Meat eaters, or carnivores, commonly do one of two things to avoid the guilt they might have involved with consuming meat products. First, they might deny the fact that eating meat does indeed harm animals and degrades the life of animals. Second, they might rationalize. This is pretty common. They might realize that eating animals does indeed deprive them of the quality of their life, but they might decide that, well, it has such high nutritional value that it's necessary. It's just an absolute necessity, and they don't know what they would do without it. So despite the fact that it might not be the ethical thing to do, health-wise, it's pretty much their only option. I'll talk about both of these things. Really, my talk will involve two main reasons why I became a vegetarian. First of all, there are ethical concerns. My reasons, ethically, range from the very, very obvious, people might be aware of them immediately, to the not so obvious and sometimes pretty hidden. I mean, you have to give it some serious thought to come up with these reasons, or to realize that what you're doing might not be the best thing for all concerned, including other animals besides humans. First of all, a very, very obvious example of some of the ethical problems with eating meat is veal. A few years ago, people started to become more and more aware of the fact that although veal is a tender, delicious meat that it isn't tough, it doesn't have any muscle quality whatsoever, they might not be aware of the fact that what it requires to become a veal calf is quite less than a high quality of life. Veal calves are kept in very small pens. You've probably seen pictures of this in magazines. They're kept in these small pens by farmers, but important to realize is not that the farmer does this just because he doesn't have enough space for these veal calves. He does it because there's a demand for white meat. And the demand for white meat, which comes from beef, and it sounds ironic, but it can be done. What farmers do is they keep them, like I said, in these very small pens where they're unable to move around. This keeps them from developing muscle tone, which would be tough in the form of steak. So it keeps, aesthetically, it's a nice thing to do for people who enjoy nice white meat. What they also do to make the meat white is they keep the cows anemic. And in order to do this, they have to be fed a diet which is completely deficient of iron. Everyone knows that anemia in humans or in animals is not something to normally strive for. Humans who have iron deficiencies take iron supplements. So, and also it's important to remember that there's no reason nutritionally that people should eat meat that is lacking in iron. It's simply aesthetics. People like the look and the taste of veal. Like I said, people are becoming more aware of the fact that eating veal might not be the best thing to do ethically. So a lot of people have cut it out of their diets. A lot of people who still might be quite willing to eat beef are even boycotting veal and are speaking out against it. This presumes that the life of a cow raised for cattle is better than the life of a veal calf. This may or may not be true. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about cows raised for cattle, beef. First of all, you know, we have supply and demand laws in this country, and it's pretty obvious. If a farmer can make more money by having 40 cows than he can having 20 cows, he'd want to have 40 cows. But in the US, there's not that much farmland available. There are more and more people gobbling up more and more land, and so the farmland is actually being reduced, while we have a greater demand for beef. So what farmers do is they have those 40 cows on a smaller amount of land than what they would have had before. The laws of supply and demand also affect the quality of life of the cows in terms of what they're fed. If you can feed 40 cows or feed 20 cows, you would want to feed 40 cows, even if this requires using the same amount of grain. And most of you probably know about what you can do to supplement a diet. There are steroids, there are other chemicals that can be injected or added to cows' foods without their permission, of course. and to aid in their growing and maturation so that they can quickly be sent off to slaughter. You don't want a cow staying around for a long time. You want it to mature and get off to the slaughterhouse as quickly as possible. So he consumes less and less of your grain or whatever it is that you're feeding him. Okay. Another thing about beef or cows raised for cattle is that the quality of their life, as I mentioned, is pretty awful. And up until the last day, it stays about the same. And the last day of their life is actually the worst day of all. Not only are they slaughtered, but the last day of their life, they aren't fed at all. In fact, they're not fed for about 2 days up to the point of their slaughter because it's a waste of grain. The food doesn't move from their intestinal tract onto their body and produce more meat for about 2 days. So there's no point in feeding them. Why should you feed this cow and then slaughter it with grain in its stomach? So what they do is they starve them for the 2 days prior to their death. Again, this is, it's in keeping with the rest of their life, but it seems unduly harsh. The third thing I'll talk about is chicken. While most Americans have cut out red meat, most Americans have not cut out eating white meat, and this includes chicken and other poultry. Since the demand for chicken has grown so much over the past few years, and like I said, land for farming and livestock hasn't increased, farmers have to deal with that. So they pack more and more chickens onto less and less land. Presumably, their profits would be growing, so they would have more money to feed these chickens, but they don't feed the chickens individually. They feed them in group, so there becomes intense and fierce competition for food. If you put down however much grain you're going to put down to feed your chickens, and then it's a free-for-all, well, you can imagine if some of them aren't getting the food and nutrients they need, it's like any other animal with competition. They become quite violent. So much to the point that often they peck at each other until the other one's death. And that, of course, presents a major problem for farmers who are raising chickens in mass. They want as many chickens as they can possibly get, and if they're killing each other, it doesn't do the farmer any good, and certainly doesn't do the meat consumer any good because prices will go up. So what farmers do routinely to combat this is something called debeaking. It's rather cruel. They cut the chicken's beak off right at the base so that the chickens can't peck at each other. And that's a fact. That's something that they do. It certainly solves the problem of them pecking at each other, and it seems in the farmer's eyes to have solved the problem entirely. However, it's quite painful for the chickens. Okay, the fourth thing I'll talk about, I've covered veal, beef, and chicken, and this is a more, like I was mentioning, some of the forms of carnivorism are more subtle than others. The fourth category is animal products which are not eating the flesh of animals, like drinking milk from a dairy cow or eating eggs from a hen. Okay, simple biology tells us that only half of all chickens or cows born for this purpose will be able to be used. That is, only female chickens can lay eggs and only female cows can produce milk. So what happens to the other half? Well, I doubt that they're allowed to go free. I mean, they're perfectly viable sources of an animal product for human consumption. So the male cows are raised and fed for beef, and the female chickens, the male chickens, are raised to be poultry. So you can see that just by eating chicken eggs and by drinking milk, you're still contributing to the degradation of the life of animals. Okay, so that pretty much covers the ethical reasons why I don't eat meat. And actually, I should point out that that was really the reason why I stopped eating meat in the first place. But since I have stopped, I've noticed considerable health benefits, which I think are worth mentioning. First of all, meat and poultry contain a lot more fat and a lot more cholesterol per ounce than do vegetables and grains. Seems pretty straightforward, but at this time most doctors are advising that people eat less fat and eat less cholesterol and reduce their cholesterol levels. A simple way to do this is to become a vegetarian, and with no ill health effects that I've observed so far. Also, when you cut out eating meat, you don't fill up as fast and you have more room, more appetite for some of the good things, such as fiber. Now, when you stop eating fat and you start eating more fiber, it seems that the net effect would be much greater than just cutting out one or increasing the other. So what happens when you become a vegetarian is you do both. You cut out the fat and you consume more fiber. You actually have the same appetite as before, but it takes a lot of vegetables to produce that full effect that you would get from meat. So you're able to eat a lot more and a lot more good things at a lower calorie cost. Also, I should mention that if you have a potato, which weighs about 10 ounces, for example, and you have a 10-ounce steak, you have to take into consideration the calories, not just the ounces. So you can't measure just strictly ounce for ounce. So that 10-ounce steak might have, say, 350 calories, maybe more. The potato, 90 calories. So you could really, presumably, you could eat 4 potatoes. Not saying anyone would, but just to measure things calorically is more important than to measure ounce for ounce. You could also supplement by eating other vegetables, which is what you should do. In fact, you shouldn't just eat 4 potatoes. The last thing that I'd like to talk about is protein concerns. This is, every time I tell someone I'm a vegetarian, they say, how do you get enough protein? And I'm sure I don't look like I'm lacking protein or lacking any other vitamin or mineral, but this is just something that people always say. They feel like it's practically the only thing you can say when someone says they're a vegetarian is, how do you get enough protein? And really, I'm sure if I asked those people where they're getting their vitamin A or their calcium or their vitamin E, they wouldn't be able to tell me. It's just that protein has taken on this life of its own. It's become the most important vitamin or mineral out there, so that when someone cuts it out, there's all this hoopla. People have written books about complementary proteins, getting complex carbohydrates. If you miss one of your 8 amino acids, none of the other 7 work, all of this stuff. In actuality, it's pretty much a myth. It's true that you need to have protein, but it's not true that you need meat to have protein. You can get protein from a variety of sources. Some of the well-known sources are nuts, grains, and beans. Some of the other sources, which are not so well-known, are vegetables, like the potato is very high in protein. The one problem with being a vegetarian is that often it's difficult to get enough calories, which for some people may or may not pose a problem. It's difficult to eat all vegetables and not fill up and still at the same time get whatever it is, your 2,000 calories, to give you enough energy for the day. This usually just only takes time. As soon as the effects of the fiber start to wear off, you get more and more used to eating larger quantities of vegetables. The last thing I'd like to talk about, it doesn't fall into the category of health or ethical concerns, but I'll mention it just briefly, is ecological concerns. As I mentioned, the population of the earth is increasing every day, farmland is decreasing, and we're feeding all of this grain to cows and chickens. At the same time, people in third world countries and even in the United States are starving because they don't have this grain. It's not to say that if we stopped feeding the grain to cows and chickens that suddenly these people would not be starving, but in terms of global ecology, it's important to remember that really people with more money consume more meat and have better health, not because they eat more meat, but because they can pick and choose from the grains that they eat from as well. But if people were to stop eating meat, certainly our world resources would be distributed more equitably and more evenly, resulting in probably less starvation. So that's it. That's all I'll talk about today. And I would just like to say that I've suffered no ill health effects for the 2 years that I've been a vegetarian. Thank you.